It's 5:05 and welcome into a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Happy Veterans Day to you. We've got a new manufacturing announcement this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. IQE Incorporated announced an expansion of its semiconductor manufacturing plant in Greensboro, North Carolina last week. They're going to be adding 109 jobs and investing well over $300 million over the next several years. This expansion, however, is partially funded by the Federal CHIPS Act, which aims to bolster domestic supply chains in the semiconductor industry. This act, introduced by the Biden administration, allocates federal funds to strengthen the U.S. technology sector, even though there are questions about its long-term effectiveness and will the CHIPS Act stay in effect under the new Trump administration. That's something we'll be tracking as well. IQE's new investment will enhance its existing capabilities by adding a metal organic chemical vapor deposition process, supporting growth in the new electric vehicle market technology. Governor Roy Cooper praised the state's pro-business climate and skilled workforce, calling North Carolina a manufacturing powerhouse. The expansion will be aided by about $275,000 worth of performance-based grants by the state of North Carolina's 1NC fund and is estimated to generate annual payroll of about $7 million with an average salary of just over $65,000 a year, well above the average salary in Guilford County where this expansion is happening. The project did also receive support from various North Carolina entities, including the North Carolina Commerce Department, Guilford Technical Community College, as well as Duke Energy. However, critics like Brian Bulford of the John Locke Foundation argue that this type of targeted corporate incentives represent favoritism and increased taxpayer burdens, calling for broader uniform tax reform that would lift up all businesses instead. The semiconductor manufacturing sector continues to see some growth, some decline here in North Carolina. We covered Wolfspeed last week. They are slowing down and laying off some individuals at one of their facilities. That's something we'll continue to track here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:07. 6 days removed from Election Day, there's still a lot ongoing in the state of North Carolina. To track the current status of the General Assembly, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning our friend Brianna Kramer, reporter over at carolinajournal.com. Brianna, we of course watched the election results last week, and there's some questions of, will Republicans have a supermajority in the House and the Senate? What are you tracking this morning in regards to that?
Yes, good morning, Nick. So it looks like the North Carolina General Assembly has retained a strong Republican majority in both the House and Senate following the Election Day results, but they have fallen one seat shy of maintaining their supermajority in the House of Representatives. So it looks like in the Senate, they have retained the 30 seats needed for a supermajority. But on the House side, they only have 71 seats currently out of the 72 needed in order to override the governor. And so really the supermajority is important because then they're able to override the Democrat governor, which was Roy Cooper, and now Josh Stein is going to be headed into the governor's seat. And so it really has allowed Republicans to pass legislation that they want. And when that legislation is vetoed by the Democrat governor, they can still override it with their 3/5 supermajority.
You attended a press conference last week over at the NCGOP in Raleigh, and the House Speaker Destin Hall, or soon to be potentially House Speaker Destin Hall, was speaking. What did he have to say in regards to Republicans falling just one vote shy in the House, and how might that change things as we approach the long session coming up in January?
Yeah, so he is situated to be the next Speaker of the House in 2025, and he called it a working supermajority. That's the same thing Speaker of the House Tim Moore has called it when Tricia Cotham, or rather before she switched parties and gave them their supermajority about a year and a half ago. So they were in the same situation, the House was, where they were just one seat shy of the supermajority. And then they had a Democrat step forward, Tricia Cotham, and she switched to join the Republican Party. And so that's what gave them their previous supermajority. And so Destin Hall is calling it a working supermajority again. He said that it's not going to change the legislature's agenda items for the long session that starts in January. But he also welcomed any Democrats to join the Republican caucus if they wish. So during the press conference, he said, quote, "The first thing I would say is we're always accepting new members in the Republican caucus if anybody else wants to change parties. And North Carolina has a changing landscape. Some areas that used to vote one way, maybe you're starting to vote another way. So we'll see. We may have some folks who sign up to actually join our caucus."
And I think that's going to be interesting, and I'm glad you brought up the idea that this won't change the Republicans' agenda. But Brianna, I think it is fair to say if they can't convince any Democrats to work across the aisle and come across and vote with them for a potential veto override, that they would potentially have to change their agenda a little bit so they could get some rather than 0% of their agenda passed under Democrat Governor Josh Stein.
Yes, that's what Representative Hall also said, is that they're willing to work across the aisle. And of course, they will have to negotiate, and they will have to keep in mind some of the Democrats' priorities in order to pass good legislation if they want to make any progress. Otherwise, 2025 is really going to be a stalemate between the Republican General Assembly and the Democrat executive branch. And so if you really want to see any action, then they will have to, keep in mind that they need to be maybe a little bit more careful when it comes to to get support from some of their Democrat colleagues. And it sounds like that's something that they will work to do. If somebody doesn't come forward to change parties potentially, it sounds like they are willing to make sure they keep Democrats' agenda items possibly in mind, or at least some of the more moderate ones that are sometimes willing to take the Republican side.
There is one race in the House that is still razor thin, and we're likely to learn more details in the latter part of this week as we get closer to the county canvass process. Which race is that, and who is currently winning that?
Yes, so House District 32, that's in Graham and Vance counties. So the incumbent Republican, Frank Sossaman, he is trailing Democrat Brian Cohn by less than 0.5%, just 182 votes. And interestingly enough, on that race, the Libertarian candidate has pulled in over 1,000 votes, which obviously is enough to swing the outcome of that election. So Republicans are keeping an eye on that race. That's enough to trigger a recount as well. If you have less than 1% difference, you can do a recount. So they are keeping tabs on that, and hoping at this point, holding out hope that maybe the Republican could potentially come through on that.
And so based on the math we were talking about earlier, if that race was to change, that would give them that 72 vote supermajority?
That's right. It would, but as of right now, it's looking unlikely still, as the Democrat is in the lead. But one other thing to note is that they will be watching for attendance records in the House, because if anybody is absent when they're voting on the House floor or voting to override any legislation, they need to meet that 60% threshold. And so if there's anybody absent, maybe you have 5 legislators that couldn't make it that day, well, then the 60% threshold is reduced. And so that's something that could Republicans mentioned during the press conference too, which is something they could do in the new year when they try to override any legislation.
Thanks for the update, Brianna. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for a look at traffic on this Monday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. We're okay.
your emergency situation station.
It's 521. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. We are also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Well, recovery efforts are still underway and ongoing nearly 6 weeks after Hurricane Helene devastated many communities in portions of western North Carolina, as well as other parts of the southeast. And for individuals who need it but have not yet reached out for help, there is now additional time to ask for it after FEMA announcing this weekend that it is expanding its deadline to apply up to January the 7th of next year for 39 North Carolina counties that were affected by the storm. The easiest way for residents to apply is by visiting disasterassistance.gov. FEMA has already approved more than $213 million in assistance to more than 126,000 households across North Carolina, and the agency is still offering even more to those in need. And while those recovery efforts do continue, some places are now encouraging their fall tourism, folks to visit and come back. Banner Elk is one of those places inviting folks back, with the town manager sharing an update late last week saying that 90% of the water and sewer services have been restored and that there are still 3 major areas without those services, but officials say projects to restore those utilities in areas like Vista, Highlands, and Elkmont will begin this week. Banner Elk's town manager added that while many volunteers have turned up to help, the historic Banner Elk School, which has been a massive distribution center, will begin the process of closing its doors over the next few weeks. For residents who still need supplies, Avery County officials are setting up a central distribution point in the Newland area, so at least we're hearing for some areas out in western North Carolina attempting to salvage the tourism season. That is absolutely great news. It's now 5:23 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. A busy week in North Carolina as we head towards county canvass following the election results from November the 5th. To get some more details on some things that you might be hearing popping up in the news, it's my pleasure to welcome to our airwaves this morning Jim Sterling with the John Locke Foundation. Jim, particularly there's an issue maybe not the right word to use, but we'll throw it in quotes, issue in New Hanover County going on with still potentially upwards of 4,000 ballots that haven't been counted yet. You're tracking those details this morning. What are you learning?
So there's been a lot of changes that have been happening with the elections over there, namely the fact that the Board of Elections apparently gave clearance to some of these counties that they could wait on counting in mail-in ballot data after Halloween, which it's kind of thrown us off now because normally with mail-in ballots, you expect that data to be in, expect to be ready, and it's good to go with a couple things that come in on Election Day, but not that big a deal. But with how they set themselves up this year, we now have, I believe, 1,700 and counting absentee by mail ballots that were not ready to go by Election Day, which frankly is a violation of the law. We should have had that stuff.
When you say not ready by Election Day, law recently changed in the state where you had to have your absentee ballot in by 7:30 p.m. on election night in the hands of county election officials. Jim, did these ballots come in after the fact, or did they come in before and they just weren't processed?
So they came in before. So what the issue was is 3 days of mail-in ballots up from Halloween to the 2nd of November. They were not counting these mail-in ballots. This usually isn't a problem. They could be able to catch up, but there's not been real clarity on why they did that. And this has led to a situation where now we don't know who won the mail-in ballots after these are supposed to be counted. Statute clearly states that you need to have the mail-in count by Election Day at 5 p.m., with the only exception being those that came in on Election Day or those that are military ballots or things required by federal law. This is something the county, I believe one of the county folks has mentioned that they may be in violation of, and the Board of Elections just seem to have dropped the ball on this.
Yeah, the county manager and some internal emails in New Hanover County seem to indicate that they could be in violation of state law with this. Jim, there's a couple of races that we're watching. Statewide one, it always seems to be that the state Supreme Court races are very close. That race now is being decided by less than 10,000 votes. And in New Hanover County, you've got a couple of local races, both the county commission and school board, that are being decided by just a couple of hundred votes. And obviously 1,700 plus ballots, as you just mentioned, still withstanding, very much could shake up those results, not only statewide, but locally as well.
That's not including the provisionals either. So we don't expect all of those mail-in ballots to be counted, nor do we expect all the provisional ballots to be counted or accepted, but that's still enough to sway some elections. This apparently has been an issue that was potentially happening statewide. I think one of the major areas it still has some, but may have solved this as of yesterday, is Wake County. Because if this was a thing coming from on high with the Board of Elections, this is something that was a rule for everyone. And that means for the statewide race, the Supreme Court, it's going to be a nail biter going into this. And we don't really have clarity on what was going to happen.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned that this could be in violation of state law. Now, you run into this interesting situation, Jim, where you have people, individual voters that followed the rules. They got their ballots in on time. And now you've got potential the local county board of elections that did not follow the law. What do you do with those votes? They were cast in a way that should have been allowed them to count, but now you've got a county board breaking the law. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy there.
It's an interesting dichotomy, but it's even more compounded because they got the clearance from the State Board of Elections to be able to do it. That's the supposed story on this, and it was based on I believe, a numbered memo from the Board of Elections. So we have a very interesting situation, and this may potentially be going to the courts to decide how the highest courts can be sitting. Bit of irony to it, but we'll see what goes on with it.
Now, that's interesting you mentioned something like this going to the courts. We're on some very tight timelines here. County canvasses have to be done on Friday. That's the 15th. The State Board of Elections meets the week after to certify election results statewide. Is there a possibility that some counties, in the case of what we're talking about this morning, New Hanover, is unable to certify their election results by the 15th, pushing potentially that state deadline back? We're a razor-tight timetables here.
Well, New Hanover is the worst about it right now because they're going to be curing provisional ballots a day before county canvass, which is going to be happening 10 days after the election, so the 15th. It's going to be a crazy one to watch, but this seems to be trying to get as close to that deadline so there's not a court case, even though there is what looks to be a pretty clear violation of the law. And it's not on these individuals. The county has to follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules, then unfortunately situations like this happen where people can be punished even though they did everything right, but the Board of Elections did not.
Jim Sterling joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at your Monday roadways with Boomer Von Cannon.
Nick, we're looking okay.
It's now 5:36. You're tuned into a Veterans Day Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. If you miss any of our show this morning, you can check out the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast wherever you get your shows. You can also visit and listen on your computer at WBT.com. Just click on the podcast tab. A semiconductor manufacturing facility known as IQE Incorporated has announced an expansion of its semiconductor manufacturing plant in Greensboro. They announced that late last week. They're adding 109 additional jobs and plan on investing $309 million over the next several years. The expansion, in part, is funded by the Federal CHIPS Act, which is aimed to bolster the domestic supply chain in the semiconductor industry. This was introduced by the Biden administration back a couple of years ago and allocates federal funds to strengthen the U.S. technology sector. Though questions remain about its long-term effectiveness, and now questions remain as to what will the Trump administration do with this CHIPS Act. IQE's new investment will enhance existing capabilities that it has at its facility in Greensboro, supporting growth in the electric vehicle market, which, however, we have seen is on the downswing and the decline there. Governor Roy Cooper praised the state's pro-business climate and skilled workforce, calling North Carolina a, quote, manufacturing powerhouse. However, critics like Brian Bulford over at the John Locke Foundation argue that this kind of targeted corporate incentive packages represent favoritism and increased taxpayer burdens, and he calls for broader and more uniform tax reforms instead for all businesses across the state, regardless of the sector that they are in. It's now 5:38 now on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Continuing our conversation this morning, Jim Sterling with the John Locke Foundation continues with us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Jim, election integrity has been a hot topic, not only in North Carolina, but across the country over the last couple of years. Obviously, North Carolina, a swing state. Just talked about some of the potential issues in New Hanover County, but there's some other issues across the state in regards to math maybe not adding up. What are you tracking on that this morning as well?
So there's a really simple principle in elections. Ballots should never be lower than votes. And unfortunately, right now, we have that situation. And that seems to be coming from the absentee file, which tracks your mail-in votes, your absentee in-person votes, your one-stop, if you will, if you're an old-school elections guy like me. And they're not adding up in certain counties in the state with what the vote totals in the presidential election, which was the highest participation that we had in this year's ballot that normally is the case. So counties like Guilford, Mecklenburg, several others have about 1,000 more ballots on Friday than they had votes in that election. We're looking through the numbers, and it seems to be that there are issues with not only same-day registrants, but other voters as well.
So with that, is this a situation where you've got just a data error going on, where you've got maybe things that are in the wrong field in a database? What you just said, I think, is the best answer here. You can't have more ballots than votes, or vice versa. How exactly does something like this even happen? How can those numbers be out of sync?
So there's typically two different data-related issues you can run into. You can run into the human errors, or you can run into the database errors. Sadly, I think this is probably both. Usually when a person same-day registers, the law requires them to have that into the file and processed by 2 days of that ballot being cast. There are certain situations where it will take a little bit longer, but by law, you need to have it done in 2 days. Now, we've seen some improvements on this file since Friday, namely in Mecklenburg County, but this is actually creating more problems than it's actually solving. The Board of Elections believe this was same-day registrants that were the issue, but when we cure the ballots, when we look at what's been added, there were about 103 of those ballots that were added in from Friday to today that were not tagged as same-day registrants. Even the ones that were tagged on same-day registrants, they are well beyond that 2-day mark that they should have been in. I think the furthest one we had was something in October 24th. So multiple weeks, this was not in the system. This was not showing that it was in the Board of Elections absentee file, which feeds into a bunch of our other data, but yet these votes are counting. Now, mind you, when we're talking about this, we're assuming the minimum on this. There are definitely some counties that have issues that we're not going to see. The ones that we're going to see are ones where the ballots the votes exceed the ballots. That's obvious. We're not going to see all the other ones where there might be this error, but the votes are still less than the ballots count. So it's causing a lot of concern for, at least for me, what's going on with our databases in our elections.
Well, and it's obviously a valid question, and I think it kind of plays into this larger question about election integrity. We had a huge statewide primary that took place in March of this year. Republican turnout in the primary much larger than the Democrat turnout in their primary. But Jim, we did have kind of a cold run on this not that long ago, and now here we are, Election Day 2024. All of these issues are propping up, and fortunately, I guess, the state wasn't that close in terms of the presidential contest, but you can imagine if this state had come down to a couple 10,000 votes in the presidential race, things would be looking very different in North Carolina this morning.
There would be an avalanche of lawyers, more so than we're already seeing with the Supreme Court race. It would be nightmarish if North Carolina was going to be the state that determined who was in the presidency, and we had a database error like this. It would be impossible to tell exactly what's going on, what votes should be counted. There'd be questions about same-day registrants, everything. Because if the numbers aren't adding up, Chief, the numbers aren't adding up. And that is not a good sign to be in for some of these hotly contested seats, some of these seats that are very close, and a few votes here, there, and yonder that should have been processed, but for some reason weren't. That calls into a lot of questions. What was going on with the same-day registrants? What was going on with some of these early votes? And why were some of these not processed properly, but their votes were counted? That should be a very simple question to answer, but we're not getting clarity from the Board of Elections.
That was going to be my question. Have you reached out to the Board of Elections, and have you heard anything back from them with clarity on these questions?
So they did respond to us on Friday when we asked them some questions, but they didn't give us a definitive answer. Their assumption was that these were issues based on same-day registrants. Looking at the file just in Mecklenburg, we can already tell that these are not all same-day registrants. Again, we have about 103 that are not in that same-day registration tag, yet weren't in the system as of Friday. That's a fairly decent concern I have for why our early voting data is not properly processed. And in other areas, we've had some other issues as well. In 4 counties, we had the data inverted for mail-in ballots and early voting ballots. They were switched. So in-person early voting was showing up as mail-in ballots on the election results page, and mail-in ballots was showing up as the in-person voting on the other side of it. So it's not just our ballots that are messed up on our data, it's our results as well. It's not showing up properly, and that's, frankly, it looks like amateur hour.
That's something that we will continue to track. Jim Sterling joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:44, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
emergency.
Hot. It's 5:51. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. We are also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Well, today is Veterans Day, November the 11th. The question, how did we get to it, Veterans Day being, as we know it now, Veterans Day? We've got to go all the way back to the early 1900s, some 100 years ago. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June the 28th, 1919, marking the official end of World War I. Nonetheless, the armistice date of November the 11th, 1918 remained in the public image as the date that marked the end of the conflict. So 1 year later, in November of 1919, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed November the 11th as the first commemoration of Armistice Day. The day's observation included parades as well as public gatherings, as well as a brief pause in business and school activities at 11 a.m. on that date. Flash forward a couple of years, you go to June the 4th, 1926. That's when Congress passed a resolution that the, quote, recurring anniversary of November the 11th, 1918 should be commemorated with the Thanksgiving and prayer, as well as exercises designed to create peace through goodwill and mutual understanding between nations, end quote. And that the president should issue an annual proclamation calling for the observation of Armistice Day. It was still called that back in 1926. By that time, 27 state legislatures had made November the 11th a legal holiday. An act approved on May the 13th, 1938, made November the 11th a legal federal holiday, quote, dedicated to the cause of world peace and to hereby after celebrate the day known as Armistice Day. In actuality, there are no U.S. national holidays because states are relegated the right to designate their own, and the government can only designate holidays for federal employees and the District of Columbia. However, in practice, almost every state follows those federal leads. And at this point, we're still talking about Armistice Day. So the American efforts during World War II saw the greatest mobilization of the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force in the nation's history. We're talking about more than some 16 million people. And in 1954, after lobbying efforts by veteran service organizations, the 83rd U.S. Congress amended the 1938 Act that had made Armistice Day a holiday, striking the word armistice in favor of veterans. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed that legislation on June the 1st, 1954, and from then on, including today, November the 11th became a day to honor American veterans of all wars. The next development in the story of Veterans Day unfolded in 1968 when Congress passed the Uniform Monday Holiday Act, which sought to ensure three-day weekends for federal employees and as well as encouraging tourism and travel by celebrating four national holidays: Washington's birthday, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, and Columbus Day, all on Mondays. The observation of Veterans Day was set to be the fourth Monday in October, and the first Veterans Day under the new law was Monday, October the 25th, 1971. However, confusion endured as many states disapproved of this change and continued to observe the holiday on its original date. And then in 1975, after it became evident that the actual date of Veterans Day carried historical and patriotic significance to many Americans, President Gerald Ford signed a new law returning the observation of Veterans Day to November the 11th. That began in 1978. If November the 11th falls on a Saturday or Sunday, the federal government observes the holiday on the previous Friday or following Monday, as well. Government offices are closed on Veterans Day. Now, it's not just something that happens in the United States. Great Britain, France, Australia, and Canada also commemorate veterans of World War I and World War II on or near November the 11th. Canada has Remembrance Day, while Great Britain has Remembrance Sunday, which is the second Sunday in November. Is in Europe, Great Britain, and the Commonwealth countries, it is common to observe 2 minutes of silence at 11 a.m. every November the 11th. In the United States, an official wreath-laying ceremony is held each and every Veterans Day at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That takes place at the Arlington National Cemetery, while parades and other celebrations are held in states around the country. It's important to note Veterans Day is not to be confused with Memorial Day, which is as well a common misunderstanding. According to the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, Memorial Day, which is the fourth Monday in May, honors American service members who died in service to their country or as a result of injuries incurred during battle, while Veterans Day pays tribute to all American veterans living or dead, but especially gives thanks to those living veterans who served their country honorably during war or during times of peace. So there's a little history for you on this Veterans Day edition, from Armistice Day back in the early 1900s to some issues trying to follow the Uniform Monday Holiday Act in the 1960s to the late 1970s, where Veterans Day continues to where it is now, November the 11th. Lots of events taking place over the weekend in North Carolina. Many more will be taking place today, as well as those Veterans Day traditions in so many towns and municipalities will continue on this Monday. We are expecting a busy week in North Carolina politics. Election results still trickling in. We'll be tracking all of it throughout the week here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. That's going to do it for a Monday edition. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We are back tomorrow morning at 5 right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.